Is it time to dismantle some doctrines? If you don't know what that means, then come along with me. I'm Dr. Clint Haycock, a former evangelical Bible college teacher and pastor of more than 20 years. Join me as we deconstruct whatever dogmas and beliefs have held you behind, and together work to reconstruct and rebuild your authentic self.
I'm really excited to be talking to you, Dr. Lucas Wilson, Canadian, expat, no, all the way from Canada. Thank you so much, Dr. Lucas Wilson, for jumping into the Dismantling Doctrine podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here and to chat with you, Clint.
You know, it's been a funny thing because I don't know how many months we've been going round and round and round, emailing each other back and forth and saying, are we going to do this thing? So we finally got this together. So thank you so much again for making this time. I know your schedule's super busy, but yes, I'm really glad to be chatting with you.
Me too. This is, a long time in coming.
Yeah, it is. So you've got a book that you said just came out. Can you remind us, what's the name of the book and what is it about?
Yeah, so I have a book that came out in January of this year. I had another book come out in March, but no one really cares about academic monographs, so we don't have to talk about that. In fact, I still haven't even unwrapped it. It's still in its box. That's how much apparently I care about.
At least they published it,
but that's...
Nobody wanted to publish my PhD. I tried with Brill and some other publishers, and they were like, nah, not interested in preaching homiletics and the Old Testament book of Ezekiel and all that. So at least you got yours published.
You know what? Thank you. Appreciate the kind words. But the book that, the other book that came out in January. It's called Shame, Sex, Attraction, Survivor Stories of Conversion Therapy. And it's a collection of 17 stories, my story included, about conversion therapy written exclusively by conversion therapy survivors. There's also a foreword by Garrett Conley, the author of Boy Erased, for anyone, who's seen the movie. He's the author of the memoir upon which the film's based. But yeah, it's 17 stories. Mostly the stories are coming from white Christian fundamentalists, charismatic and evangelical context, though there are a few others, one from an Orthodox Jewish background. There's one from a secular context. There's one from what the author describes as a Chinese cult. So there are a few others. The vast majority really are coming from the white Christian nationalist or white Christian fundamentalist and evangelical context, which really tracks the research. The research suggests that the vast majority of conversion practices are happening in religious context, particularly in conservative, high control religious context. So that's the collection. And yeah, a bunch of stories, different countries, Canada, US, and Australia represented. And the stories are varied, and it gives you a broad overview of what conversion practices are, but also offers these 17 stories that give voice to experiences in conversion therapy. And so I'm super excited that it's now out in the world.
What's the basic drive? What's the driver behind this movement? What are they so concerned about? The homosexual agenda. I remember that when I was growing up in fundamentalist churches in 1979, when I was 13, my pastor was big into Jerry Falwell, the moral majority. And I remember that going back to 13 years old, secular humanism's creeping in and the homosexual agenda. And I don't even know what that means. I was a 13-year-old kid. Yeah. It was bad. It sounded bad. And I thought, what's going on here? And what is the driver? Why are they so concerned about this quote unquote homosexual agenda? What's the problem?
Yeah, I'm still trying to figure out what the homosexual agenda is. I think it's just to live peacefully and have the right to exist, but it's a crazy idea letting queers just be. So and it's funny too, even bringing up Jerry Falwell and the moral majority, right? Like I went to Liberty University, Jerry Falwell's school that he founded, and that's where my conversion therapy experience, happened for 4 years. But if we go back to the moral majority, which of course, like you said, starts in 1979, but even before that, we have Anita Bryant, that gem of a human who, again, really loved the queers. Yeah. And I think that when we're talking about, queerness as an issue, it has, of course, a history. And before 1976, 1977, when Anita Bryant sort of breaks onto the scene, it wasn't as much discussed. It really was within that short amount of time that we see Anita Bryant sort of catalyze this conversation and debate as if there's nothing to debate, but according to them, there is. And then Jerry Falwell rides on her coattails like he did for a lot of things. And then 1979 hits. And again, this is where this rhetoric of the gay agenda, the homosexual agenda, and looking for special rights, not just equal rights, but special rights, breaks onto the scene. And then it's amplified as time goes on, of course. And of course, we have other people who are in the conversation, as Pat Robertson and, different organizations like Family Research Council, Focus on the Family, these different sorts of organizations. But with asking what is so scary about homosexuality, what is so scary about sex, really, I think is maybe even the broader question, right? Why are these folks so scared about anything that relates to gender or sexuality? I think it's a fair question. And I don't think that they necessarily know themselves. I think in part, it was initially, if we think about this historically, it was a money grab for fundraising campaigns, right? We see how well these folks did when they campaigned and said, we need your money. Why? Because the queers are out there and they're doing these nasty things and they don't reproduce, but they recruit children. Alliance with Native Right, which is an amazing marketing tactic, that sly woman, but obviously has horrible implications for queers across the globe, particularly though at the time in the US. I think in part, there is this economic aspect that it very much brings in money and has brought in money over time. I think also that evangelicals, they operate on a binary, right? That male, female, man, woman, wrong, good, evil, of the enemy of God, right? Everything is neatly categorized in these two distinct sort of categories. And again, the binary reigns supreme for these folks, that there's not much ambiguity in the world, especially when it comes to morality, right? It's all this sort of black and white understanding of everything. And the gray isn't really part of their cosmology. Though, of course, I think if they were honest with themselves, they would recognize that it is. But I don't think that they're the most self-aware group. So we're not waiting or holding our breath for them to figure that out. So I think to myself that for them, whenever anything troubles that binary, whenever anything is beyond the binary or is a wedge in that binary, it doesn't neatly fit within their cosmology, it doesn't fit into their world. And so anything that doesn't fit, anything that's different or foreign or other is scary. And I think for them, again, they want this neat, ordered, tidy world where everything has its place and everything, is answer. They have an answer for everything. And I don't think that this, again, really fits within that system. So I think that when it comes to sexuality, if you're queer in some sense, if you're gay, lesbian, bi, whatever, that doesn't fit neatly. If we're talking about gender, if you're trans or non-binary or genderqueer, whatever, however you identify, that again doesn't fit neatly. But I think it goes beyond sexuality and gender. We can talk about race, we can talk about class, we can talk about a number of other things. But I think that within this system, anything that is foreign is scary and that's why oftentimes these folks don't know queers. And if they did, I think it would be a lot less scary. But again, they're not necessarily looking for any olive branches to extend to anyone. They're not looking for a community beyond their own community because again, evangelicalism is a totalizing system that is also colonizing system that anything it comes in contact with, it tries to subsume within itself and change into itself. It's everything and made it its own image. And so I think that it would be nice if they would explore otherness in an open and curious way. But I think that they're allergic to difference. They're allergic to diversity, equity, and inclusion, all these things that are bad, of course, now, particularly within the Trump administration and beyond. But, a lot of these ideas and a lot of these fears are coming from and generated by the religious right, and they had them for years. And again, there's a history there. We're just now seeing the really difficult fruits that a lot of us have to deal with because we're the ones who are under the microscope being queer, whether it be in regards to gender, sexuality, or otherwise. So I think that for them, it's, again, there's the economic aspect, there always is with these folks. But then on top of that, I think there's very much this sort of worldview allergy to anything that's different. And I think that's in part why homosexuality, queerness in general is so scary.
That's a really good point. I was thinking about that because last year I was reading through the Project 2025 playbook, the mandate for leadership and all that. And it struck me when I read through the section on the family, there's the through line, as you were just saying. And I was raised in the Bill Gothard Fundamentalist Cult Institute and Basic Life Principles. And I was raised under focus on the family. I remember as a kid, we used to listen to Dr. James Dobson on the radio. My parents were a big fan of his and all that. A lot of people were, still are. But they would say the two sins affecting America are homosexuality and abortion. And each of them can be traced to the family. If you define a family, and this is what Project 2025 was trying to do, they were saying, we define the family as a heterosexual, one man, one woman couple, having children, and therefore then raising them in a godly home, and all the rest of it. And there's the dominionist piece. We're going to reproduce generations of children, godly children. They're going to turn around and have godly families, and we're going to just quiverful and all that stuff. So you can think, okay, the rubric of the family is a powerful driver for these people, isn't it? They could say, so a same-sex couple does not fit God's template for a quote-unquote normal family, whatever that means.
Yeah, even the family, right? It's again, they're brilliant marketers. These folks, who wants to be anti-family? Who wants to be against the family? And if you're pitted against the family, that seems like a threat because according to them, it's the basic building block of society, right? And this is oftentimes this language that they use. And then if you again think about like society and the basic building block being the heteronormative, straight, monogamous family or monogamous couple with children, that they've oftentimes made the claim that queers are once Rome embraced homosexuality, well, it ran to riot and ran to
downfall
ruin.
of Rome.
And so this idea that queers are against, again, the family and what's more American in their mind than the family. And then on top of that, it's against civilization. It's not just a threat to queers aren't just a threat to the family, they're a threat to the entire country. And of course, when there were conversations around gay marriage and, obviously this feeds into this, but also like gays in the military, queers in the military, this was also something, right? They're a national threat. They're a threat to not just like civil sort of society, but also to the actual safety of the country, that we are threatening them, whether it be by being in the military or through AIDS and all this, right? There's all of these sort of narratives that they pick up on, should I say, that again, relate back to like exactly what you're saying, the family. And if you're not within this heteronormative, monogamous, one man for one woman, again, and as they say, like one biological man for one biological woman for life, then you're falling outside of God's order and out of God's design. And that's for them a scary threat on multiple fronts. And when they have these different angles, that again, it's against the family, it's against society, it's against the health of a country, it's against physical health as well. When all of these sorts of boxes are checked, it really is, a really strong marketing tool that really incites a lot of fear, a lot of panic, that people then give their money willfully, and then they give up their hearts and brains to this sort of movement, because again, they want to protect themselves, their children, and their grandchildren. And this is it's a very emotionally laden or effective way, bringing people onto their side and keeping those who are on their side already within the camp.
You made a great point about the marketing earlier, because I was thinking about that. It's been proven, Dr. Randall Bulmer, Catherine Stewart, and other people have shown conclusively now that, going back to Jerry Falwell and others, they jumped on the abortion piece because they were told, hey, this is what's going to mobilize your base. They were originally upset about segregation. That was what it was really all about. That's the true origins of the Christian right. Randall Bulmer has shown that the true origins of the Christian right are actually, they were angry about segregation, schools like Bob Jones University. Jerry Falwell was a segregationist. He doesn't want that publicized, but it's true. He was a segregationist. They were upset about the government removing their tax exempt status from places like Bob Jones. But they were like, we can't mobilize people on that ground. Hey, support a racist Christian, and then it was like they came along and said, no, listen, abortion, that's your ticket. Get people angry about that, and homosexuality, the homosexual agenda. And we're going to get so many people fired up and angry, and they're mobilized by fear and anger and everything else. And that's basically the Trump base, as I see it. The guys that Jerry Falwell was mobilizing back in 79 and all that, they've become that's Trump's base, isn't it?
That's it. And speaking of Randall Bulmer's book, like you're referencing Bad Faith, where in the beginning of the book, it opens right with this scene where he's in this sort of behind the scenes meeting. And they explicitly said, this is exactly the religious right or the moral majority in these different organizations, or whatever the movement, also specific organizations within it, that exactly like they explicitly state out loud the thing you're not supposed to say out loud. That exactly was segregation, was the integration of schools that really catalyzed this movement. And it wasn't abortion, because you can look at Catherine Stewart's work or Kristen Dumais' work, where they talk about how in this earlier 70s and especially in the 60s, a lot of these organizations like Christianity Today and other evangelical organizations were pro-abortion. And then we hit a certain point, and then all of a sudden it's the rallying cry, and then we're made to believe in a very ahistorical way. That's what started things. No, it wasn't. Again, the other conversations predated these things. And like you said, Jerry Falwell, a raging racist and segregationist, though he has to come to Jesus well, when apparently all is well and God's on his throne afterward. But I think that it's just wild how ahistorical these folks are. And I think typically what's ironic about it is how they oftentimes try to use history, again, their construction of history, and not just interpretation, but like construction, because it's like completely that. It's a construction, it's a fabrication of a bunch of different things. Whether if we are thinking about homosexuality, it's always that this is the way it's been forever. And we've always been against this. And then if you look at like the historical sort of like development of homophobia within the church, we think back to 1946, which is when homosexuality first enters the Bible, right? Like that language was not used for any translation up until 1946. And again, there's a history there. There's obviously a lot to talk about there, and there's a documentary about it now. But all this to say is that they make it seem like this has always been the case. And it's not. Again, like not to say that Christians have been like super open and cool for like queers throughout all time in history. They haven't.
No,
but it wasn't the way that it's been. No, but it's not been the way that it's framed. And then again, this idea of abortion, that we've always been against abortion. Like we have like very clear historical documentation, not just coming from like historians, but like from these organizations. You go into their archives, you can find documentation of them changing their narrative. Again, they were one thing and now they're not. But it's just wild that this is a group that oftentimes tries to claim that they are history's on their side, and that if we look back through time immemorial, that we've always thought these things are unchanging because God's unchanging. But apparently God changes a lot. If we look at a number of different topics, whether it be slavery, whether it be homosexuality, whether it be abortion, and the list goes on, it's just, again, the irony is there. And it would be funny if it weren't for the fact that these people wreak so much havoc on so many communities through the ahistorical reconstructions, or should I say constructions of history.
Absolutely. I remember reading some quote from Jerry Falwell Sr., and he basically said exactly that. It was the second I read that article in the newspaper that abortion had been passed in Roe versus Wade in 1973, I was outraged, and I immediately started mobilizing it. BS. No, absolutely not. It was years later before he ever said anything about abortion. And it was only because Paul Weyrich came to him and said, hey, that whole segregation thing, that's a non-starter, man. Abortion's where it's at. Homosexual agenda, that's where it's at. That's what's going to rile up your base. So that's it. Now, speaking of Jerry Falwell, you mentioned earlier, you went to Liberty University. So how did you end up there? Of all places, were you raised in evangelicalism? How did you end up at Liberty University?
Yeah, so regretfully, I ended up there. Maybe that's the way I can say it. Or regrettably, I don't know, whatever. So I was not raised in the church. I actually came from, I think the best way to put it is that my mom was haunted by her Baptist demons. My dad was this hippity-dippity musician, record store owner, eventually became a social worker, but had a music studio art based and wrote a book on Bob Dylan, like jazz. Like, he was a cool guy. And then there was my mom. And my mom, again, she had this religious background where her parents, they were Baptists. And I think she was always haunted by that. So that certainly affected how I was raised. But it does not mean in any way that we were a Christian family, because we weren't. Like, we went to church. For me, I'm the youngest of 5 kids. And we went to church up until I was in grade 2 or 3. Before that, we would go to church on and off again, but it was never a consistent thing. And like any good Canadian family, we just went to the cottage on weekends. So we weren't at church per se. And when we were in Toronto, I was born and raised in Toronto. When we were there, again, it just depended on the weekend. Sometimes we'd go, sometimes we wouldn't. But ultimately, my siblings had much more of a religious, upbringing than I did. But again, even to call it a religious upbringing, it wasn't really like, my mom taught me how to say my prayers and how to say grace. And that, like, we'd go to church, we'd come home and we'd shut the hell up about Jesus. And we just didn't talk about it. It wasn't something that we chatted about. And my dad certainly didn't care. If anything, he was like, I really don't want to talk about this, because he knew that if we said anything quote unquote wrong, my mom would be pissed. So really, it was just not a Christian family. And I'm very thankful for that, because it always gave me one foot in, one foot out. And I think it made it a lot easier for me eventually to leave the church when I did. But, and during my childhood, again, there was this in and out, relationship with the church. But then it was in the summer before grade 9, just before high school, my brother got really into the creation versus evolution debate. And he was like, Luke, you got to watch these like DVDs. And what the hell? Okay, what are these DVDs? And it was all these debates with this guy named Kent Holden. He's technically a doctor, but he got his degree from a degree mill. And his name's he calls himself Dr. Dino, and he has no training in anything scientific at all. But he actually eventually went to jail because he said that it was God's money, the money that he owed to the government, but the government seemed to disagree, and so they imprisoned him. But putting that aside, so I started watching these DVDs with him, and he was like, at the time I thought it was cool. At the time I thought it was really cool. And when I was watching these DVDs, I started looking on different websites and then doing a little bit of quote unquote research, we can call it, that would be so generous with the term. And I started going all these Dr. Ken Ham, right? Creation Science Museum or whatever.
You knew his name had to come into it at some point.
Yeah. Our good friend.
Answers in Genesis.
And so
Noah's Ark.
That's the one. There we go. Yeah. It's like
Ham.
museum in Kentucky. Oh man.
Oh yeah.
So all of this really eventually, because I thought, okay, if I believe that there's a creator, I should probably figure out who this creator is. And so I didn't do much digging, because I thought, if it's the God that I was raised on, obviously there's my answer. So I went to the church that, again, we had on and off again gone to, and it was a Fellowship Evangelical Baptist Church, which it's translated that it's like Southern Baptist Church. And so I started going to this church again, and then, I kind of didn't stop. It was like I was obsessed, and everything Jesus was cool to me. I really quickly got saved, although at the time I thought that I already was, but whatever. It was this sort of like gradual, within a few month process, that I eventually became this like zealot for God. and on fire for Jesus. And anyway, I fast forward through high school when it was time to make my decision of how I was going or where I was going to go for university. At first, I thought I was going to go to a Bible college out in Saskatchewan, which thank God that didn't. At least I went somewhere a little bit bigger than Briarcrest, which is a shitty little Christian college out whatever in Western Canada. But I was actually said I wasn't going to do that. But instead, I was thinking, okay, I'm either going to go to University of Toronto, which is Canada's best university, or I was going to go, which I eventually did, to Liberty University, which
What a
is arguably
choice.
one of the US's. Oh man, yeah, I always say that we make decisions, and sometimes
we
they're
do.
not great. And
Text at the
decision.
time, that's the thing, isn't it? We're in a context, aren't we? That was our context. I went to Bible college or seminary, same kind of thing. I was fired up for God. It made sense at the time. It answered all the questions, ticked all the boxes.
And that's it, right? Because I think for those who are outside of these circles, for them, it's like, how could you ever allow yourself to think this? But again, when everyone around you, or at least the people that you trust and you put that sort of, you esteem them in a certain way, when they're all saying one thing, of course you're going to believe it, right? Like it's confirming your understanding of reality. And so for me, my reality was that God is in control, that it's Jesus lives, the Holy Spirit lives in me, Jesus is still alive, all this kind of tomfoolery that really makes you, again, make decisions that are according to the herd. They're according to the group and follow dutifully because you're told to.
It's
And
social
there's really no other
conditioning.
option.
Yeah, it is. It's social conditioning. You're in a bubble, and that's your bubble. And everyone around you believes the same thing, says the same thing, does the same things for all the same reasons. Why wouldn't you go along with it?
Exactly. And it makes it quite easy. And again, going back to even just the idea of this binary of the world, it's safe, right? It's comfortable. It's wonderful when you think, oh God, I've got all the answers. Or I would have said, oh gosh, before. Oh gosh, I've got all the answers. And it's nice. You feel like I always felt like I was smarter than everyone else. And I realized once I got to grad school, I'm absolutely not. At the time I was living according to this fiction that I know Jesus and Jesus is the answer to everything. Therefore, it was this quick, easy math, to be crude about it. And so I think that for me, when I made the decision, again, there was actually a big reason why I chose to go to Liberty was, again, when I was at the time making my decision, I was thinking, okay, like pros and cons, like what are reasons to go, what are reasons to stay, and whatever. But the only thing when I was making my little checklist of like reasons to go, the only thing I gave 2 check marks for was the fact that I knew that Liberty had a conversion therapy program. I didn't understand it as conversion therapy at the time. I didn't call it that because that wasn't the language I was using. But I knew that they had this pastor on campus who was tasked with working with queer students to straighten them out, specifically male students. And so I had gone down to Liberty about 6 times in total before I eventually went to the school and attended as a student on these different trips where you'd go down and check in the school because my uncle, my mom's cousin, whatever, like second cousin or whatever that makes him, he was the national recruiter in Canada. And so he had said, we should come down for this trip and check out Liberty. At the time, I was like, there's no chance I'm going to like Virginia. Why would I ever want to do that? It was from Toronto. Toronto's this like amazing, multicultural, fun city. And I was like, I'm not going to like the South. Yeah. But then
going backwards 50 years.
Exactly. And again, even though I was hyper evangelical, I was raised on a very strict diet of anti-American sentiment. So I did not want to go to the States, but I especially didn't want to go to the South. And speaking of thinking I was smart, which again, apparently I was a little jackass when I was in high school, which I think I was. I thought I'm going to be smarter because they're all from Virginia or they all live in Virginia. And I thought like they're just backwoods sort of whatever. Again, I've since come to terms with the fact that I'm not even close to the smartest person in the room 99% of the time. But putting all that aside, I decided that I would go to check out the school. And for a young Canadian, everything's super exciting in the American college system. For us, university is kind of boring in comparison to what happens in the US. And so I went down and I saw this big school. It's a squeaky clean, shiny campus. And it's like manicured grounds and all these new buildings. And I thought, gosh, look at this. This is great. And Jerry Falwell's big idea was always, if it's Christian, it ought to be better. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to go down, which we found out that, again, to be precisely that of fiction. But at the time, I was like, I want to go to this place because it looked exciting, looked cool. And again, I knew that it had this program for gay students that if they were to enter, they could become straight. At least that was the promise made to them. And so for me, when I was making the decision, that was a big factor as to how I actually got there. And then eventually I enrolled and I unfortunately graduated from Liberty University.
Wow. Now, wait a minute. You got to go back and explain something to us because, okay, where were you at in terms of your own sexuality at that point? Because you're saying you knew about this conversion therapy. I've heard about this minister, whatever his name was, that specialized in quote unquote conversion therapy at Liberty. So where were you at? Did you know at that point? Were you out? What was the story there? Because were you going there saying, oh, God's going to make me straight? Was that the idea partly that made the decision for you as well?
Yeah. So I I was not out to anyone other than, you remember, what was it called? MySpace. Remember MySpace?
Oh
I
yeah.
had come out to one guy on MySpace. That was the extent of my, at that point, coming out process. And I knew that he would never see me again. So it was easy for me to
You were
talk.
pretty
That was
safe.
the only person. That was it. But it felt safe. But that was even before I even got in. Anyway, I don't remember the timeline exactly. But all I know is that he was the only person I had ever verbalized I am attracted to men. And otherwise, it was a secret. But at the same time, I think to myself now, it's kind of when my mom expressed complete surprise when I came out. She was like, I had no idea. I'm like, Mom, I watched like a lot of HGTV.
Yeah.
Like the Cooking
Really?
Network was always on. What the hell are you thinking? But she was apparently surprised, which is, again, just a crazy idea to me at this point. But the writing was on the wall. And so I went to Rosedale Heights School of the Arts. What was she thinking? But maybe she just wasn't thinking. And that, anyway, other story. So
You didn't want to see it.
yeah, you're blind to what you exactly what you don't want to see. So for me, I wasn't out to anyone. Again, I think people knew, like, how could they not? I know that a lot of my high school friends knew, but they also knew that I was evangelical. So they thought he's never going to come out. And then my church friends, I have no idea to this day if they knew. I'm assuming some of them knew, but again, I just don't know. And I don't talk to any of them anyway anymore. Pardon me, they don't talk to me. And that's sort of, they made that decision quite easy for me. Once I left the church, they left me. Yeah, I think that for me, definitely knew. I knew since I was like 7 or 8. Like I knew from a very young age that even before I had the realization that I was queer, I knew that I was different. And I remember even like my friends, their dads, whenever I would go to my friends' houses, their dads always looked and treated me very differently than the others. They always thought, I think they probably thought that I was going to turn their sons gay or try to. But for me, I was just like, I'm like my best friend from elementary school. I'm at his house, or my other friends from elementary school, I'm at their house. And their dads were always just kind of like weird to me. And I remember being like, I wonder why they don't like me, but the moms love me. The moms loved me.
What's that about?
Yeah. I thought I was this free, like linguistic or like nascent understanding of the fact that I was different. I didn't know what that meant until eventually I realized, yeah, I like men. And since that was clear to me from a young age, but once I entered the church, I knew that was no longer an option. I was made to believe that was not an option to be both queer and a Christian. I'm not a Christian now. I'm not religious at all. But at the time, I thought I had to choose. And of course, when God enters the picture and it's choice between you and then your sexuality is considered like you're choosing yourself over God, a selfish choice. Of course, you're going to choose God within this religious system, right? So I decided that I would go to Liberty, but I still think about this. And I think I love my former self in this sense. There are a lot of things that probably I'm a little embarrassed about at this point, but this was a hilarious little like former Luke, childhood Luke, teenage Luke, which was my big idea was that I was going to go to Liberty and I was going to go through the conversion therapy program. What was the goal? However, I wasn't going to go right away. My big idea was that I was going to go down and at first I was going to have fun with other Christian guys. Because when you're in high school and you're in a public or a secular high school, you can't, do things with guys because people are going to find out and then they're going to say, oh, wait, aren't you a Christian? It's going to be bad PR for Jesus. Like really, you're tarnishing your witness. So I thought, but if I'm at Liberty, they're all Christian anyway. So if I choose something with them, it's not like A, they're going to tell on me because they're just as guilty as I am. And then B, they're also, again, like they're already Christian. So they're not going to think, they're going to think poorly of Jesus. So that was my big idea. I was going to go down and have my fun with Christian guys and then the last minute change and become straight and find a woman, whoever she is, it didn't matter. And then go back to Canada and live that sort of like straight life. It didn't work out that way, clearly, but that was the big idea. And yeah, weirdly,
wow, I can't believe that. How could that not work? So this was the idea
that plan.
But so it wasn't a case of, I'm going to go to Liberty so that quote unquote, God can make me straight. That wasn't the idea of going to the conversion therapy. Did you want to be straight at that point? Because it's a sinful lifestyle choice. That's guys like Falwell. That's what they would say. You're not born that way. No, it's a sinful lifestyle choice. You chose to be gay, Lucas, and that's your problem. You're going to infect the rest of us and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, it's contagious.
Yeah.
Again, the plan was to go have the gay fun and then become straight. So it was, again, I was trying to have my cake and eat it too. Yeah, have fun and then settle down with the old ball and chain kind of thing. But initially, the big idea was to be, again, have fun and then enter into this role that I was expected to perform, which is straight husband, father, whatever. And so initially, again, I was going to hold off and then eventually change. But that was what I thought I was going to do because I thought, again, within that system, there's no possibility for queerness. There's no possibility to just be myself. I had to change in order to fit the very basic definition of membership. And if I didn't, that couldn't be a part of the system. So again, I thought that I had a few gap years of fun and then really take everything seriously and settle down. Again, it clearly didn't work, but that was the goal. And the idea of choice and the idea of agency, and this is something I've been thinking about more and more just because I've been writing about the topic more and more, is what does it mean to choose to do this? What does it mean to attempt to erase the very constitutive part of who and what you are? Can you consent to abuse? Can you consent to these damaging practices? And yes, at the end of the day, I'm the one who said, I want this. But instead of saying I want, they oftentimes say now that I was made to believe that I wanted this. Again, I don't think that that's really choice at this point. I think that's something that's a little bit more complicated, bare minimum. Again, not to absolve myself and think I had no part in this. It was all their fault. Obviously, I was a part of this, but I think for me at this point, I definitely chose, but there is that sort of like complicated element to it.
When we come back in the second half of this conversation with Lucas Wilson, I want to get into this issue of conversion therapy, specifically what were his experiences of surviving going through conversion therapy at Liberty University. I'm really fascinated by this whole conversation. In fact, Lucas is the first person I think I've ever talked to that actually went through conversion therapy in a fundamentalist, conservative Christian sort of environment. So I want to find out what that looked like. And then when we get into the end of the episode, turns out that Lucas is an expert on the Holocaust, and I'm really interested in history as well. So we're going to actually dive into that. And believe it or not, there is a correlation, there is an overlap between all the stuff we've been talking about and what happened in the Holocaust. So stay tuned for that in the second half of the show. I just wanted to mention what is coming up here in the next few episodes. I know we've kind of had a detour a little bit because I've been doing a lot of stuff on Project Esther and Van Spelter and all the rest of it, but we're going to get back on track now. So after this one drops with Lucas, I'm going to bring you the episode with Stephen Mather. He's an ex-Jehovah's Witness, and we had a really fascinating conversation about comparing our experiences, he as an ex-Jehovah's Witness, me as an ex-evangelical. And what we did is we specifically went through each of the 8 of Dr. Robert J. Lipton's markers of cults from his book, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism. And we compared stories. We talked about our experiences and our various cults that we were a part of. And we talk about the psychological effects of each one too. And I think that's really, really helpful. It's not enough just to say, okay, these are the things that they did to me while I was a part of this particular religion, cult, high control religious group, whatever it was. You can name it. That's very empowering. But the other half of it is you can understand how it affected you psychologically in terms of your own growth, your own mental health, your own well-being. And that also tends to disempower what they did to us. And it gives us empowerment, like I say, to sort of rebuild, reconstruct on the back end after you come back out of it. And then I've got a really exciting announcement. I'm going to be interviewing my very, very good friend, Frank Schaefer. And I always love talking to Frank because he's one of those kind of guys you just kind of, you don't really interview him. You just kind of steer him in a direction and you let him go. You let him rant. So I love talking to Frank, and we're going to be hitting on subjects like Project 2025, Project Esther, what's going on in the Trump administration, the Trump era. I know he's done a lot of stuff on his own show about this. So this is really good news to be able to touch base with Frank again. And also this same week that I'm interviewing Frank, I'm going to be interviewing a person. She goes by the name of Taking Off the Tinfoil Hat on Instagram and Threads. Got a lot of followers there. And I'm really excited to be touching base with her. So we're going to be doing that interview as well the same week that we interview Frank Schaefer. So lots of really cool stuff coming your way down the pipeline. I'll just mention 2 really good news. My book, I think it should be out there now. Hopefully, I'm going to check with my editor, Tim Sledge, but he has uploaded all the files to Amazon for my book, the Audible version of Not So Shiny, Not So Happy People, How Bill Gothard, Church and Family Taught Me Christianity Doesn't Work. Those should be uploaded to Amazon now. So if you want to go ahead and buy the book, or if you already have it, you can purchase the Audible version. That is me doing the narration of my own book, which was a huge milestone. And I'm so glad that I got that done. So hopefully that'll be out there. And I think at some point too, I'm going to read another couple of chapters and put those out there if you want to get an idea of what the book is about. And then also if you want to support the show on Patreon, if you support the work that I'm doing, the links to that, as always, are in the show notes. And then as a benefit, you get to be part of the closed Dismantling Doctrine podcast Facebook group, as well as getting access to our monthly Dismantling Doctrine podcast Zoom calls, which will be starting back up again in the month of September. This is a great benefit for being a Patreon supporter of the show. you get to meet returning guests, people that are coming back. And so you have a chance to meet them and talk to them a little bit. In fact, speaking of returning guests, in the month of August, this is another thing I forgot to mention. I'm going to be interviewing Catherine Stewart. She's got a book that's just come out called Money, Lies, and God. And so we're going to be talking to her. So again, I've had her on the show many times before, and then she's come back as a guest on these Zoom calls. So great people like Catherine Stewart, people like Frank Schaefer. This is your chance to meet them, and you get to do that only as part of the Patreon community for the show. All right, let's get on back into the second half of this conversation with Luke Wilson. We're going to get into this issue of surviving conversion therapy. What was it all about for him? He's going to tell his story as we continue this look at shame, sex, attraction, surviving conversion therapy.
What actually happened when you got into the conversion therapy? How did it work? Was it very traumatic? Now looking back on it, you've obviously written about it. You've got a book of other survivors who went through it. What did it actually look like? Take us through the actual process.
Yeah. So what did it look like, and how did it work? First of all, it didn't work, Clint. Apparently not, or clearly not. No.
I'm shocked.
There was, it's so strange. When I started the conversion therapy program, the one-on-one program, I went to both the one-on-one program as well as the group program. The one-on-one program, I went for all 4 years. I was at Liberty. The group program I only went to once, and that's actually the story that I recount in Shame, Sex, Attraction. We can talk more about that one after, because I only went once. And so I wanted to have some sort of representation of that. In my next book, I'll be doing my one-on-one experience of conversion therapy. And so when I first went to the group or the individual program at Liberty, before I even got into the room with this pastor, I decided that I wanted to make sure that I wasn't going to get in trouble if in fact I came to him and talked to him. I thought, what happens if I go and talk to him and he tells the university or tells my mom or whatever? So I made this fake email. And at the time, again, this gay kid coming from Toronto, I was like, what's the furthest identity, or what would be like a persona that I could construct by way of email that is as far away from gay 18-year-old Luke from Toronto? So I made this email. It was something along the lines of Texas football. So I made this email. I said, hey, if I come talk to you, will you get me in trouble? Will you report me? Like, blah, blah, blah. And he said, no. The conversion therapist, his name was Dane Emmerich. He said, no, as long as you're not going to self-harm, in a physical sense, I'm not going to report you, and that your secret's safe with me, kind of thing. So I was like, okay. So I went and I started meeting with him. And what actually catalyzed the whole situation was the fact that I had, on every dorm at Liberty, there were 2 RAs, 2 spiritual life directors, and then a bunch of parameters, and then the rest of us plebeians who weren't spiritual enough to be on leadership. And so one of my spiritual life directors actually made a move on me, and then we had this weird encounter. And then afterwards, he wouldn't talk to me because he was fully awash in evangelical shame. And so when I had no one to talk to about this, because obviously it's not street cred to go and tell your friends at Liberty that, I just hooked up with my spiritual life director, now he won't talk to me. So I was like, gosh, and I did talk to one friend, but that's only by chance that it even came out because he was also gay. But I didn't want to burden him with just this knowledge, and just always shoulder my, struggle at the time that my spiritual life director won't talk to me anymore. So instead, I was like, I'm going to fast track my idea. I was having fun with other evangelical guys and just go to conversion therapy. But again, I didn't conceptualize it as conversion therapy. I just thought about it as going and talking to this pastor who's going to help me with my quote unquote same-sex attractions. I emailed him. He said, come meet with me. We met. So the initial first few meetings that we had were different from the rest. And the reason why is because he was trying to set up this sort of framework and a pseudo-Freudian approach to human sexuality, which was asking a lot of detailed questions about my relationship to my parents, my dad, to my mom, to my siblings as well, to other folks. And then also asking a lot of really uncomfortably detailed questions about my teenage porn habits and what I thought was sexy. And did I like daddies? Did I like twinks? Did I like all this kind of stuff without using the language? But of course, finding a way to ask these questions without asking those specific questions. But it was this really bizarre sort of interrogation into what I was thinking and feeling as it related to my gender and sexuality. And so those first few meetings really framed the rest of my time in conversion therapy, because for him, the narrative fit in the sense that within these sort of spaces or circles, it's believed that either the mother is overbearing or the father is absentee and emotionally distant, or maybe both. For me, my dad was phenomenal. My dad was like super cool, and I was super close with him. He died when I was 16, but up until that point, we were like thick as thieves. Whereas my mom is overbearing. And so that fit the narrative. And for them, it's all you can
explain
take what you like. That's it. They take what they want and they leave what they don't. And so was like, oh, that must be it, your mother. So we really focused on Cheryl. My mom's name is Cheryl, the wild woman that she is. And so that was the basis of our meetings. And so after the first few meetings, we had, we had a sort of a routine for every week. And the routine was that we would read this book that he gave me. And my book, he had different books over the years, but the book he gave me was Alan Mettinger's Growth into Manhood, Resuming the Journey. A lot of really strong implications in the title alone, let alone the text itself. But, that was the conversion therapy manual I read for my time at Liberty. So we would talk about, we would also pray. And whenever we prayed, it was always him praying for me, never me praying for myself, which I think is quite indicative that he was the sort of intermediary between God and me, not allowing myself, which of course within Protestant traditions, that's allowed, but he apparently had more control over my connection to God in that sense. We read scripture together. Obviously, we read the clobber passages. We read other scripture verses as well and whatnot. But we also would take a weekly inventory of my slip-ups and my victories. My slip-ups were times that I gave into temptation. And my victories were the moments that I resisted temptation. So instead of looking at porn, I went for a run or whatever it might have been. So that was generally the what we did. And every meeting was also bookended with really weird physical contact. And I'm not saying that he molested me or anything like that, but every time we would meet, it was always started with this big bear hug, right? We would meet and have this big sort of sort of overwhelming hug. And then it always ended with that as well. But on top of that, whenever he did pray, he always put his hand either on my shoulder or my leg. And I was talking to someone else not too long ago about their experience with him as well. And the praying thing, I said, what was like when you guys prayed? I forget what this specific question is, but what he brought up was every time he prayed, he would put his hand on his thigh. And he said, it wasn't like enough to make you say stop, but it was also enough for you to clock it and be like, wait a second, this is a normal
boundary there. Yeah. It's a little,
and of course,
a simple thing, but yeah, it's something there for sure.
And of course, evangelicals, this idea of boundaries and personal space, and also not just physical space, but just personal space in general. There's no such thing, right? Like you always share within the first 10 minutes of anyone you meet, you tell them that who you voted for, that you have a porn habit, and that you're addicted to caffeine. I don't know. It's like you tell everything, and it's this confessional sort of religion. So there's no such thing as personal boundaries. So for me, when he was doing that, not only was he a trusted figure, but on top of that, I was already conditioned within this high control religious group to share everything and to give everything and just to allow him to do whatever he wanted to do. Why? Because he was in control. He was authority in my life at the time. So that was really part of it as well. There's that tactile aspect. And so at this point, I think to myself, when I recount this to myself or to others, I've had one of the responses that people have had is, that doesn't sound too bad. It sounds, you just talked to someone and that was it. And he told you how to sit, how to walk, how to stand, modeling. This is how a real man behaves and operates. But for me, I've thought about this a lot over the years. What the sort of violence of conversion therapy for me didn't really necessarily happen in the moment. Yes, there were certain obviously damaging and harmful narratives that were accumulating over time that he was amplifying that of course I had heard before. But I always think of conversion therapy as an amplified homophobia or transphobia, just particularly in one space. And so obviously there was a lot of sort of recapitulation of other narratives or arguments that he'd made throughout, I had put throughout my life, particularly when I was in the church. But the thing that I think about now is that when I was in conversion therapy at Liberty, I was meeting with him on this weekly basis. So I had this constant contact with someone who kept telling me that everything was fine. If I just keep focusing on Jesus, if I just keep running the race, I will eventually find a woman, like a unicorn of a woman, whoever she could be, that I'll be attracted to. And then when I find her, I latch onto her, nail her down, and then marry her. And so that was, again, it was this constant, don't worry, you're fine. You're doing well. You're you're sort of doing what you're supposed to be doing. However, when I left Liberty, I went to a master, which is a public school in Canada for my master's. And it was there that I no longer had this constant reaffirmation that everything was fine. And it was there that I started realizing, wait a second, things aren't changing. Because when you're in that system before, when I was at Liberty, there were things where, I wouldn't lust after a guy and therefore things were changing. This is evidence. But when I was out of that system and he didn't have that constant pat on the back, I started realizing, no, nothing's really changing. And of course, within evangelicalism, it's not God's problem ever, God's fault that you're not changing. It's never that God's the issue. So therefore, if God's not the issue, and I had gone and talked to Pastor Dean, I had fasted, and you added up all of the weeks that I fasted, there were been months that I just didn't eat for the sole reason of spiritual edification. That I read scripture, I prayed, I read books, whatever. All of these sort of activities and things that I had done that was trying to get me to become straight. I thought to myself, okay, I've done all this and God's not the problem. God obviously wants this from me. What's the problem? It's me. I must be the problem. And of course, when you see yourself as a problem, the problem. And for me, that was this moment of realization that's where I think the shame really kicked in. Before, I think I would argue that it was guilt, but I felt bad for individual specific transgressions, whether it be looking at porn or masturbating or whatever. But when I eventually realized it wasn't just the thing that I had done that was bad, but it was me that was bad, or at least I was made to believe that I was bad. That's when the shame kicks in. And then there's all of a sudden self-hatred and self-abnegation. And there's this sort of like snowballing of negative feelings and emotions that are directed towards the self. And that for me is really where a lot of the violence of conversion therapy happened, was after the fact, that I had accumulated all these messages. And when my lived reality was not aligning with what I was told would happen, all of a sudden, I think that's really where things fell apart. And eventually, I did deconstruct because of things falling apart. So in some ways, it was a blessing in disguise. However, that took years of work, whether it be therapy or just reflection and thought and whatever, and thinking through and feeling through what I'd been through. It was necessary in order to come to terms with what happened. And I think about that, coming to terms. I came to language, and I was able to put into language what happened. And that's when the healing process for me really began. But all of this to say is that conversion therapy, it happened, and there was certainly negative things that occurred in that space. But for me, a lot of the damage was really done afterwards, or at least I felt the damage done afterwards when I was in the world by myself without my conversion therapist.
Yeah, once you saw the other side or experienced the other side, anytime you're suppressing your authentic self, that's never a good thing. Because I talk about this in my experiences of evangelicalism, Dr. Robert J. Lifton's concept of doubling. I've said this many times. It's this two selves living on parallel tracks. One's your authentic self, the other is your religious self. And it's the mask. You wear the mask to fit in and be accepted and everything else. But you're actually doing damage to your authentic self. The longer you carry on that doubling, you're suppressing your true self. And I wonder, is that the actual narrative? Because I remember hearing this when I was in evangelicalism. Okay, we can explain this same-sex attraction, as you say, overbearing mother or abusive father. A lot of it's sexual abuse. You were abused sexually, so that's why you went gay and all that. But it's not such a bad thing to be attracted to another person of the same gender. It's just you can't act on it. We have to suppress that. And with God's help, you won't act out, quote unquote, on that impulse. And therefore, eventually you become straight when you meet the person of the opposite gender, whether it's a man or a woman. Is that kind of the basic narrative, the sort of theology that sort of goes along with it?
100%. Yeah. There are multiple ways that homosexuality is conceived or understood within evangelicalism or the New Christian right. It's understood as a gender deficit. So oftentimes they'll say, you were a young boy and you were hanging out with the girls, you were playing with dollhouses, you were in your sister's dresses, all of which was true for me. And therefore, once you hit puberty, you were at that point, up until that point, you've been living in the world of femininity. So at puberty, you go for what's opposite of you. Again, we're back to this binary understanding of the world. And you went for what was opposite. And for me, what would have been opposite was boys and then eventually men. And so it's this idea of gender deficit, the gender deficit really being the underlying factor for why a lot of kids are queer. It's also, homosexuality is understood as an addiction, right? It's framed in the, again, Anita Bryant talked about it, Jerry Falwell talked about it, and a number of folks since have talked about it as an addiction. It's understood as a social threat, right? It's understood as a contagious sort of condition. It's never understood as just an integral part of who someone is. It's always understood as something that's separate or something that people encounter, and then an addiction, you think some people are predisposed, but Jerry Falwell had very different. Anyway, Jerry Falwell has a lot of ideas, and none of which surprisingly are accurate, but neither here nor there. But there's all these different ways that it's conceptualized, and so they work in tandem. Oftentimes, it's not one or the other; it's all these different things. It's this idea, and I'm fascinated by this idea of doubling and this idea of performance, because so much of conversion therapy, the way to fix all of these quote unquote issues, or the way to fix homosexuality or gender deviance or whatever they might name it, the way to fix it is performance. And it is a legitimate performance of gender and a performance of sexuality. And they say, essentially, fake it till you make it. So they'll say, it's not a matter of what you do that'll make you straight. It's just a matter of what you do that'll make you straight. And you're like, wait a second. Did I hear you correctly? Yeah. And it's really where it's saying that at a certain point, you're acting like a real man. And of course, within the definition of a real man is a heterosexual man. So that at first you're going to be acting like a man, but over time, you're not just going to act like a man. You're eventually going to become a real man. And that sort of habituated persona that you've been performing will not just be a persona, it'll actually become who you are if you do it over time and long enough and, with enough focus and dedication to Jesus. And so that, for me, this idea of performance I have thought about it in this sort of dramaturgical or theatrical way. that it's so much of evangelicalism. This is not just within conversion therapy. And like you said, like they expect you to have sort of the public face and then also who you are behind the scenes. And even that behind the scenes, right? We use all this language that I think is really coming from the theater because so much of it maps onto our experience. Like that we're told we can't just be ourselves. We have to constantly weigh and measure and consider every little thing we do. And of course, the emotional labor and psychological labor that you have to exert to do all this is like unbelievably tiring, right? Like I think so many of us, when we left the church, we felt like we could like breathe again because we didn't have to constantly perform. We didn't have to constantly be something that we weren't, because apparently who we were behind closed doors was bad. And so I think that although we talk about conversion therapy, I think to your point that within this broader religious system, it's not just encouraged to act, it's required to act. Because if you don't, you're going to get the boot. You're not going to be a part of the community because you don't, again, align in every way the way that you're supposed to align. And if you don't align, well, you're goodbye. And I think that this is endemic to this entire religious movement and community or communities. And I think it's just like disgusting at the end of the day.
Would you plug in something like religious trauma syndrome as part of that? Because surely everything you're describing is part of RTS. I mean, by definition, religious trauma syndrome, anytime you're trying to act and be someone you're not in a fundamentalist controlling religious context, you are doing damage to yourself. That is the definition of trauma, isn't it? And then you add the religious piece. God's going to fix you. God's going to make you straight, whatever it might be, whatever the narrative is. Surely that's a recipe for trauma.
You know what? It's funny that you bring up trauma because most of my research in the past was in trauma studies. And it was really by way of literature, actually, that I did this. And so not necessarily from a strict psychological or emotional or therapeutic context, though, of course, we brought in those voices and those authors. But for me, when I think about trauma, I oftentimes think about trauma as the moment that your brain or your mind, should I say, was really trying to protect itself. Right? That something exceeded the limits of your capacity to really take in what's going on in your brain, or pardon me, your mind is really doing its best to protect you. It doesn't want you to, to be overwhelmed or overtaken by whatever's happening. But sometimes there are these moments or experiences or events that really exceed our mind's capacity to register what happened in a linguistic or even like an imagistic way. And so it's wild when I talk to people about their experiences, or when they write about their experiences in the collections that I'm putting together or have put together, or just in conversations, where they say it's really foggy at this moment. This happened and then they don't remember the rest. And that's a trauma response, right? It's your mind saying, this is too much, I'm going to protect you. And again, sometimes these moments come back to us years later because all of a sudden that moment is imprinted into our psyche and we're finally able to, oh, that's what happened. And I've had those moments. But again, I think that for a lot of people, it's that their minds are just trying to protect themselves in those moments. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about trauma. It's these limited experiences that exceed our ability just to register what the hell happened. And so many people I've talked to, so many people whose work I've encountered, they bring up these things. And again, they'll say, oh, it's foggy or it's hazy. And we use different language to describe trauma without saying, oh, this was traumatic. Some people say it's traumatic and they're like brand direct, but I think a lot of people will say, even recently, someone was saying, this happened in the classroom, but after that, I don't remember the rest of the classroom experience, even though I remember everything up until that point super clearly. There was this moment that everything else just became, foggy or blurry. And I think that is, again, it's 100% what we're talking about when we're talking about trauma. These experiences align with and are definitional examples of traumatic religious trauma moments that, us up, to put it academically.
It really does, yeah. I know we're running out of time, but I do have one other question. I know you've done a lot of research and work and writing on the Holocaust. That was your background initially, wasn't it, in academics and everything? Do you find there's an overlap between these two subjects? Because obviously you talk about trauma. We talked before we hit record. I was into Holocaust literature. I really got into it years ago. And I remember reading Night by Elie Wiesel. And one of the things that struck me, I still remember this, was the center of the book when he talks about the minute he lost his faith in God. And he's standing in the middle of Auschwitz looking up at this chimney, the gas chambers, crematorium. And he says, there is no way there's a God. If this is true, and this is what's happening to me right now, basically, I've lost my faith in that exact minute, that moment. I think, okay, there's clearly a religious piece here. And the Nazis persecuted homosexuals. They put many gay people to death in their camps. So what have you found to be an overlap between these two fields of study?
Yeah, it's funny you bring up Wiesel. I wrote my master's thesis on Night. And the moment you're talking about, he says, I no longer believe in a benevolent God. I cannot believe in a benevolent God in the way that I had, at least up until that point. Wiesel has a really wild sort of engagement with God after that. but the God that he had believed up until that point. And I have a moment, it certainly wasn't obviously in Auschwitz. I think a lot of us have these moments where we think, I just can't believe in the God that I've been raised to believe. But for him, of course, being one of the most extreme moments of human suffering, i.e. the concentration camps, particularly Auschwitz, are the metonym of human suffering and human cruelty. That for him is this moment, right? And he's seeing, these children being tossed into the crematoria. And so, Dazelle, his work, I think there are multiple connections, right? We can think about trauma studies informing our approaches to both topics, whether it be evangelicalism and like evangelical homophobia and transphobia, and also the Holocaust. Of course, we're not making any sort of like comparison in the sense of who suffered more. That's a zero-sum game and not a game that I think a lot of academics are intend to make or play, should I say, because it's just zero-sum, it's fruitless. But the approaches to these topics, certainly there are a number of connections, right? We're talking about human exclusion. We're talking about human marginalization. We're talking about ways of othering people and the tactics that undergird these different forms of hatred, right? I think about the anatomy of hatred in general. What causes us to eventually hate an entire group? What are the steps or the mechanisms by which people train others? And it is a sophisticated system to remove people from our sphere of moral responsibility. Right. There's obviously like a language part to it. It always starts with words, right? That we say, oh, that group, they're cockroaches. Oh, that group, they're vermin. Oh, that group, they're whatever, right?
They're animals.
They're rats.
That's what
animals.
Trump said, immigrants are animals and they're vermin taking over the country. That's exactly the language that Hitler and the Nazis used in the 1930s. Propaganda films of rats scurrying through the streets of Berlin and all the rest of it. Those are the Jews coming in. The same language is being used now, isn't it?
Yep. Exactly. And we start with language. From there, again, there are other tactics or strategies, not just like animalizing or bestializing folks, but also demonizing folks, right? Thinking about how like different verses in scripture lend themselves very well to demonizing other groups of people, particularly Jews. And if you think about, even thinking about like anti-Semitism in the form that the hatred, obviously, that undergirded the Holocaust, right? Thinking about the different stereotypes that are oftentimes associated with Jews, that they're money hungry. That, of course, goes back to Judas being the purse holder. Of course, the fact is that Jesus was Jewish himself, but putting that aside, there's not necessarily, again, always the most, what's the word, logical way of looking at things, but, that they're money hungry, that, that bloodthirsty, the blood libel, the myth that Jews were killing Christian children using their blood for matzah. This is, of course, coming up.
They killed Christ. That's the ultimate crime, wasn't it? Christ killers.
Deicide, right?
Yeah. Anti-Semitism is not a new thing by any stretch. It's medieval Europe. They were blamed for the plague and everything else.
Yeah, exactly. And then thinking about Jews as being these like oversexed individuals who are like lecherous and preying upon Christian women. And then, of course, there's also the other side of it where they're seen as like effeminate and limp-wristed and sissy boys. Always there's no real consistency. There's just multiple stereotypes that are operating in different ways at different times and in different capacities. But nonetheless, they're still believed. Both of these are believed, right? And there's also the idea that we can make some modern day connections. If you think about immigrants, like they're stealing our jobs, but then also they're the lazy ones, right? So it doesn't mean that there has to be rhyme or reason to it. It just has to follow the narratives that they're given. And so with gays, again, gays are oftentimes associated with pedophilia. They're oftentimes associated with sexually preying upon others. So we're Jews, right? They're seen as, they're these rich, affluent people who they make more money than the rest of us. They could be a minority. And of course, Jews are also seen as, they can't be a minority because they make so much money. They're so powerful, right? Gays are considered so powerful in Hollywood. Who else is associated with Hollywood? Jews, right? There's so many parallels here. And you can pick any marginalized group. You can think about Black folks, right? That Black men are seen as preying upon white women. There's, again, every sort of layer of this hatred finds its expression in different iterations, in different places, in different contexts. It just is repackaged for a different context or for a different audience. And so there's so many connections there. There's so many methodological sort of approaches or theoretical approaches that for me, I do work oftentimes by way of oral history as well as literature and then also archival documentation. And so how I approach both these topics is quite similar in that sense as well. I think that there are so many connections that we can draw. And of course, when we think about the 80s with even the ACT UP sort of movement, they were drawing upon a lot of Holocaust imagery, like the pink triangle, right, is invoked. And so there's the connection between the Holocaust and queerness in the US specifically, and then eventually becomes a global symbol. But there are so many connections that we can make and so many things we can sort of, similarities that we see between these two groups. Again, they're wildly different, but there's also a lot of similarities in how they're perceived and also how people approach these topics academically afterwards. And I'm fascinated by both these topics. And I think, again, there's a lot of really like fascinating connections between the two. They might not be necessarily easily recognizable from the outset, but I think once you, again, spend time in these with these groups and also thinking about the conversations that these folks are having, you see a lot of the connections.
Absolutely. And my concern is watching Trump's rise to power the second time. I'm not the only one who said it, obviously, but it has too many eerie parallels between that and Hitler's rise to power. The rhetoric, the language, the way that the political cult of personality and all these things, and like say the othering of certain people, they're not going to stop with turning back Roe versus Wade. Their next item on the agenda is anti-LGBTQ rights, trans rights. And that was one of the tickets Trump ran on one of his planks in his platform. There's only two genders, and male and female. Here in the UK, we just had a ruling. We talked about this before. We're saying there's only two genders, male and female. And we're trying to roll back the clock and go back to a time when it was this golden age. And there just weren't queer people around, Luke, because they just didn't exist. There were only men and women in traditional families with white picket fence and 2.5 kids and all the rest of it. And that's the slippery slope, I think, toward fascism, isn't it? Hitler didn't just come to power in 5 minutes. It took years of conditioning the German people, accepting this narrative, and eventually it paid off, didn't it?
And when I think about Trump and Hitler too, like a connection between the two is that neither were religious themselves. Religion laid the seedbed for both of them. And I think about with Hitler, 2,000 years of Christian, what was it? 1945 years of Christian anti-Semitism laid the seedbed for the Holocaust. Without the Christian scriptures, without Christian theology thereafter that again interpreted these scriptures, the Holocaust would not have happened the way that it happened. And that's full stop. A lot of my early research was actually on that topic specifically. But we think about Trump, right? Trump's not a religious guy. Trump, for a long time, seemed quite open to difference and otherness before he became a political figure. He was okay with the gays up until he joined the Republican Party.
Yeah.
And so I think to myself, when we think about the new Christian right, since the 70s, I think to myself, obviously there were people before, like Billy Graham predates Jerry Falwell and whatnot, but Jerry Falwell very much tried to, again, ride his coattails and follow his example. But without the Christian right, without Jerry Falwell, without Pat Robertson, without these absolute nuts, without these folks, Trump would not be in power. I just think about how bombastic and over the top Trump is. Jerry Falwell is the religious prototype that made that possible, right? Like he would say whatever just to get a soundbite. He would say whatever just to get money. He would say whatever. And that sort of, what's the word? Just like careless and violent rhetoric. Again, that was not the way that things were done at least again, within religious context. Yes, there were crazies. Of course there were, but not the way that Jerry Falwell was, because Jerry Falwell had a big platform too. And that's a big difference that he had, the old time Gospel, he had his own radio station, his own TV station, his, whatever, like he had his own mega church, he had his own university.
Reach, yeah.
And so I think with that, like we can see, and we can trace such a clear line between Jerry Falwell and Trump specifically, but again, we can branch out and name other, white Christian fundamentalists and then, evangelicals as well. Even there's that documentary about Jerry Falwell Jr. And the pool boy, if you've heard about that, his son, all that tomfoolery. That in that documentary, they don't say it outright, but they do trace a direct connection between Jerry Falwell Sr. And then eventually Jerry Falwell Jr. and then Trump. And again, Jerry Falwell Jr., the first prominent evangelical who endorsed, right? And we then saw that 81% of evangelicals voted for Trump, right? And so Jerry Falwell Jr., in that sense, his son, the cuckold that he was, he again enabled Trump and gave him a platform in a way that Trump wouldn't have had otherwise. But again, thinking about his Jerry Falwell Sr.'s legacy in his son's life and how he would have obviously influenced him, there's so many connections that we can make from these crazy Christians, from these crazy conservative Christians from the 70s and before and also after, and how that leads up to Trump. And so that's another example, I think, another connection, another parallel. Of course, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And we can see how it has rhymed most recently in the US with Trump.
Absolutely. I was going to say, you talked about Kristen Dumais. I've had her on the show a couple of times, and Jesus and John Wayne. That's the basic argument of the book, isn't it? It was celebrity pastors like Falwell and Falwell's Jr., Mark Driscoll, so many other people that paved the way for Trump, an authoritarian white male leader. These people have been conditioned for decades. And it's a guy who gets away with everything. Every sexual peccadillo he gets away with. Oh, we're going to repent. He's going to repent. He's going to be restored. He's going to be back in ministry soon. That's Trump basically on steroids, isn't it? He can do anything he wants, and the evangelicals are like locker room talk. So anything can be excused. I was going to say, we are running out of time. I've actually loved this conversation. We could go on and on. I would love to talk to you about the Holocaust some more and all this, how this all connects together. But remind us again, what's the name of your book? And then how can people find you if they wanted to get a hold of you on social media?
Yeah, so my book is Shame, Sex, Attraction, Survivor Stories of Conversion Therapy. You can buy it on bookshop.org. It's actually, they support local bookshops if you're in the US. So that's fabulous website or way to get it. There's also Barnes & Noble. You can get it in Canada. It's through Indigo. In Australia, it's the Nile and blah, blah, blah. So there are different ways that you just Google it. Don't support Amazon. That's all I think about at this point. Otherwise, it's, pick your battle or pick your poison, whichever one you want to buy it through. You can also buy it through the press itself in the UK and also in the States and in Canada. So that's the way to get the book. If you want to follow me on social media, I'm on Instagram. I'm at Luke Slam Dunk Wilson. On Blue Sky, I'm at Luke Slam Dunk Wilson. On Threads, I'm at Luke Slam Dunk Wilson. But then on Twitter, I thought I'd keep it consistent, and I'm Wilson_FW.
Okay.
Otherwise, you can find me on LinkedIn and Facebook and that kind of stuff as well as Luke Wilson or Lucas Wilson.
Yeah, so if people want to touch base with you, there's a number of ways to do that. Thank you so much. You go by Lucas or Luke? I've been calling you Lucas, but you go by both.
Call me whatever you want. Just don't call me late for supper. You know what I mean?
There you go. Okay, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and we definitely need to touch base again. So I will be hitting you up at some point. We'll touch base again. Thank you so much.
Thank you.